Welcome back to Irish Granny. This is part 5 of our book Stoned by Asia Raden. We're beginning chapter 6, the old shell game. The golden eggs that started the Soviet startup. So, let's see here. Rebellions happen. Revolutions are made. Russian tradition holds that gilded eggs were gifts for the Tsar at Easter time. The Tsar comes from the Latin for Caesar, and it's the emperor of the Russian Empire. And in 1883, Nicholas was sent a death threat in an Easter egg. So let's read about that. It was the gem-obsessed Tsarina that day who first dug into the treasures from the Easter egg gifts and started cracking open the jeweled eggs. Inside of the most beautiful egg were a small silver dagger and 2 skulls carved of ivory, which represented the new Tsar and Tsarina. There was also a lovely card that accompanied it, which read, "Christ is risen," the standard Easter greeting. But this one also said, "You may crush us, but we nihilists shall rise again." Ooh. The peacock egg. Okay, periodically throughout this chapter, there are descriptions of Faberge eggs. A Faberge was a jeweler and a craftsman who every year made these beautiful eggs out of jewels and precious metals for the Tsar and his family as gifts. And the Tsar would commission an egg as like a coronation egg, or in honor of your birthday egg. Elaborate, gorgeous things. And there are descriptions of many of them throughout this chapter. I'm only going to read you this one because we'll be here all day. Yeah. So the peacock egg is named for its surprise inside. A horizontally set crystal egg sits on top of an ornate swirling golden base. Though the jeweled egg is embellished with ornate etchings, the crystal is still primarily transparent, so as to display an elaborate gold tree inside. In the tree sits a splendid mechanical peacock. The peacock itself is made of multicolored gold, glittering enamel, and various colored gems. It's fully articulated. When wound, the peacock spreads its tail, turns its head, and walks back and forth. It's one of the eggs that best exemplify the image of opulence, luxury, and unfettered excess associated with the vanished Romanov era. And I'll have to say this because it comes to mind for me, but there are many black and white, mostly, video clips on YouTube, and some of them are just short clips and some of them are incorporated into documentaries. The Romanovs, the last family of Romanovs who were murdered, very difficult story, beautiful daughters and a young ill son, all shot with the parents and a couple of servants by the Bolsheviks. But it's easy to be deceived by appearances, because if you read the story of what these people were really like, and there's a book that includes, I forget the name of it, I'm sorry, it includes letters between them to each other and to their other relatives and to people in the government. They were horrible. It's shocking because they look like butter would not melt in their mouths. They had such contempt for the Russian people and such an inflated sense of their own importance in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of God and in their own eyes. It's just such a stark contrast from their appearance. It's easy to watch these mostly silent films and feel really sad because they're all beautiful and there's a lot of elegance and fancy schmancy going on, but oh my God, talk about despicable. I'm not saying that they deserve their fate. I don't believe that at all. But I'm just making the observation that the dissonance between their appearance and their opinions is just striking. So, the Romanovs were an anachronistic and out-of-touch monarchy, an autocracy. They had absolutely nothing to do with the common people. They lived in total isolation from them. The court was one of unparalleled luxury. The Romanovs only associated with the highest of nobility, and they were mixed with other royal bloodlines. They weren't Russian at all. Nicholas II was 1/128th Russian. His wife Alexandra, her real name was Alex von Hesse Darmstadt. She was Queen Victoria's granddaughter. She was of English mostly and Danish blood and had been born in Germany. Nicholas's mother was Maria Fedorovna. Dagmar was her first name, and she was the sister of the King of Greece. Interestingly enough, Prince Philip, who died recently, was the son of the Queen of Greece. Nothing to do with English blood whatsoever. They were all Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. In 987, Vladimir of Kiev, or Kiev as it's now called, converted to Orthodoxy after seeing the jeweled, gilded opulence of the cathedral at the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Eggs were a Russian tradition. They come from pagan religious tradition. They symbolize fertility, and in the spring festivals of one sort or another in almost every culture to honor the beginning of the year and the birth of everything new. And often in almost every culture, eggs are used to celebrate fertility and renewal of life. And the Russian nobility brought it to a whole new high by having this jeweler create these beautiful eggs. Maria Fedorovna got the first Faberge egg. In 33 years, 52 eggs were made, and they were as much jewelry as they were art. They're absolutely gorgeous, and there's a few pictured in this book, and it's just a wonder to behold. And each egg held a surprise, and often they were mechanical, or they worked of one way or the other. Faberge was a guy who moved from France to Russia to St. Petersburg in 1842. And he made many objets. A little something from Faberge was the obsession of the nobility. He was a visionary and a creative genius and a good businessman and a boss, and he fared very poorly at the hands of the socialists, the communists, not socialists, the communists, what's their names, the Bolsheviks, because he actually had a truly revolutionary way of running his factories where all the workers were part of it. It was very socialist setup. And it still actually hasn't been reproduced since. He invented a lot of jewelry techniques as well. The enameling that he did, his contemporaries were only able to represent a few different colors, and Faberge had the choice of 150 shades of color. His workers were happy. He gave them credit for their work. He didn't just claim this is a Faberge egg. He would say who the workmen were, who made the various parts of it. So he shared credit. He dispersed profit amongst the work people. He provided health care, unheard of in those days. He had to flee the Bolshevik Revolution, and it's very ironic that many of his eggs were used to finance a repressive regime because he was what you would have thought they would have wanted. During the revolution, many works of Faberge were destroyed for the money that the jewels or the gold got, but Lenin saved some of the eggs, most of the eggs. The Russian Revolution was bought and paid for by the German government and the United States during World War I. Now, this is going to shock everybody. We're responsible for the establishment of the USSR, but that's actually a historical fact, and this is how it happened. Henry Ford, an unrepentant racist, and Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon took $6.6 million in 1930s to buy stolen Russian treasure in New York City. So they used the money to buy this stolen Russian treasure. The money went to the Soviets, and then Henry Ford and Secretary Mellon took a tax deduction for this little enterprise. No end to it. Armand Hammer, now that name should be familiar. His grandson is into all kinds of trouble, reputed to be a cannibal, too, as a matter of fact. Armand Hammer engineered the sale of millions of stolen Russian jewels and objets and used the money to give to Russia. He was, and this pretty well now known, this is not an assumption, Armand Hammer was a Soviet spy, and he was set up ostensibly in private business to sell Russian artifacts and the possessions of the nobility that he claimed to have purchased on the black market or purchased in the market and was selling them internationally. Actually, the Soviets had given him everything, and he was a front for them, and he sold them and gave the money. Alexander II, Nicholas II's grandfather, knew people were unhappy, and he was a reformer and a modernizer. In 1861, he was called the Tsar Liberator because he freed the serfs. He signed a document to convene an elected national council, and this was thrilling. This would have made Russia a parliamentary form of government. On the way home from this vote or signing, his car was bombed by a nihilist, and because he was too progressive, and it destroyed everything. It didn't kill him, but the second bomb they threw did. Easter of 1881, Alexander III, Nicholas's father, rescinded this national council. He was an absolute autocrat. He was a strongman dictator. Nicholas II was a putz. He never was taught how to be a czar. He was a spoiled rich boy who had no ambition. He was passive. He also looked like the twin of his cousin in England, the King of England. It's shocking. There are photographs of the two of them standing side by side with their big beards, and they look like identical twins. It's remarkable. Nicholas was completely unprepared to be czar, but his father, Alexander III, died suddenly at the age of 49, and Nicholas, at the age of 26 in 1894, was suddenly and unhappily found himself czar. Nicholas was 26 years old, timid and completely unprepared to rule, and he knew it too. On the momentous occasion to be crowned, he is alleged to have said, "What is going to happen to me and all of Russia? I am not prepared to be a czar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling." Unfortunately for everyone, rather than turning over the reins of power to another better suited ruler or accepting the help of a close cabinet, the prodigal son got all dressed up in daddy's clothes and tried to play dictator. In 1895, he began his reign with a now infamous address stating, quote, "Let everyone know that I will retain the principles of autocracy as firmly and unbendingly as my unforgettable late father." 45 should take note of what happened to this autocrat copying his late father and what happened to him. He came to a bad end. He was a reluctant dictator. He had no vision. He did very little besides vacation with his family. Sergei Witt, a Russian minister at the time, said, quote, "I pity the Tsar. I pity Russia. He's a poor and unhappy sovereign. What did he inherit and what will he leave? He is obviously a good and quite intelligent man, but he lacks willpower, and it is from that character that his state defects developed. That is, his defects as a ruler, especially an autocratic and absolute ruler." He was right. Nicholas II was not a bad man. He just wasn't a good man either. And his reign was defined by a terrible combination of incompetence, intransigence, and inevitability. Coronation festivities were something else. 2 weeks worth of partying. 7,000 guests who were the 7,000 guests who were the who's who of global royalty. On the fourth day, in a place called Kodinka Meadows, there was to be a traditional ceremony in which the commoners got to celebrate the coronation. And as is traditional, they would be given free food, free beer, and commemorative cups, cheap metal commemorative cups. 500,000 people showed up, hundreds of thousands of more than they had expected. The crowd realized that there were too many people, feared there would be shortages of food and drink, and people were already desperate anyway. And there was a huge surge and a crush in the area. Thousands were crushed. The Cossacks were the security, which was a lot like having the Hells Angels be the security at Altamont. They opened fire on the crowd. Nicholas was informed after all the dead were cleared away, and he said nothing and just attended the ball that night. It was the beginning of his reign and the beginning of the end of his, the beginning of the end of his popularity. He was incompetent, ineffective, and callous. And I don't know if I mentioned this in my notes, but Alexandra miscarried that night because of the shock of this massacre. Maurice Paleologue, the French ambassador to Russia, would eventually write, quote, "I am obliged to report that at the present moment the Russian Empire is run by lunatics. Over time, their Western European relatives slowly distanced themselves from Nicholas and Alexandra, who then retreated into their small immediate family and their intense Orthodox religion. Gradually, they had less and less in common with either their own people or their relatives abroad, and they were related to the royal families of England, Holland, Belgium, Italy, Yugoslavia, Denmark, Germany, don't know about Sweden, Prussia, Greece, somewhere else, Poland? Now I'm making things up. let me get back to the book. So actually, Nicholas was talked out of canceling this ball. He really wasn't necessarily as callous as it might have appeared, but it did appear very bad. And the Tsarina was so upset by the massacre that she miscarried. Perception is everything. They were considered cold-hearted. Humans have the drive to overconsume, to covet, because we're driven by the biological imperative, the unconscious imperative that resources may at any time become scarce, and so we have to make hay while the sun shines. You can buy momentary happiness, but it wanes quickly, and they've done studies that's absolutely true, that anything lasts longer, that sense of happiness lasts longer if what you pay for is something expensive. And if it's an experience, even better. So to actually pay for a trip that you would remember is a better way to spend your money than to buy an article of clothing or an object. Thinking about something, thinking about buying it, and thinking about getting it creates the same sort of neurochemicals as actually buying it or actually getting it. So you could save some money because you get the same neurological response. And you can revisit the memory of an experience better than you can the memory of a thing and get the same response. So it's money better spent. Luxury and status items are positional. Their value increases, gets higher if other people have less of that particular thing. But creature comforts are not necessities, and they don't gain or lose value based on what your neighbors have. So at the turn of the century, The upper and middle classes were doing well, and business was booming and industry was growing in Russia. This fallacy that we seem to have, because that was my misperception too, was that life was so horrible in Russia that there was a revolution. That's not true. The upper and middle classes, which were a pretty big chunk of the country, were doing great. Their industry was great, lots of innovation, doing well in international economics, but everything was done on the backs of the barely paid and overworked peasants. They had no land, they owned nothing, they had very little pay. They were lured into the factories and in the cities, and they finally got a glimpse of what it was they were missing. And there was no leadership because the nobility was out of touch with absolute power. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, World War I, and 4.5 million troops were sent by the Russians into battle, but they had no modern infrastructure. Some of them had no shoes. And Germany had modern military, highly trained, advanced weaponry, advanced transport, heavily relying on transport. And in the first 5 months, Russia lost over 1 million men. The army was so bad that soldiers just surrendered rather than freeze or starve to death. They had poor military leadership. They had no weapons. They had no shoes. They were forced into retreat in 1 year. They lost territory, so they went to war and ended up losing territory, and that lost face for the Tsar. He fired his cousin, who was in charge of the military and who the soldiers actually loved, and he took over the military. This was terribly disruptive because he didn't know what he was doing. People didn't respect him. He was held personally responsible after that for all of the deaths. And he only kept doing it because they only were able to keep doing it because they had a lot of cannon fodder. They had a lot of people they could throw at the enemy. By 1917, rural people had fled to the cities. There was mass conscription. They had abandoned the harvest, so there was famine and death, and they had a very bad winter, which destroyed what little they had left of crops. On February 23rd, International Women's Day, thousands of women marched for bread. Very similar to the French Revolution. 200,000 factory workers went on strike, and the middle class and students joined them, and the motto was "Down with the Tsar." On February 26th, the troops shot hundreds of people in the crowds. February 27th, the troops put down their weapons and joined the rioters. So they were sick of going without shoes and what weapons they did have, and starving and freezing and being used as cannon fodder. Where do I have? By March the 1st, 1917, 170,000 troops had joined the mob. On March 2nd, the entire government resigned, and they formed a provisional government without the Tsar, and on March 3rd, the Tsar was forced to abdicate. The Duma leader, Mikhail Rodzienko, had sent a telegram to Nicholas at Army headquarters, saying the situation is serious. There's anarchy in the capital, the government paralyzed, transport of food and fuel completely disorganized, public disaffection growing, on the streets chaotic shooting, army units fire at each other. It is essential at once to entrust a person enjoying the country's confidence with the formation of a new government. There should be no delay. All delay is death. Nicholas responded by saying that fat Rodzienko has again sent me some nonsense, to which I will not even reply. So he was forced to abdicate. In 1848, Marx had written the Communist Manifesto, which was just a thought exercise, economically and socially. unsound and unviable. It wasn't meant to be put into practice. Poverty is relative. It's true that if you see somebody with luxury items, you will be jealous and want them and feel a loss and everything. But the great equalizer is when there's a lack of necessities. If all are equally rich or all are equally poor, no one is unhappy. It's like a one-class system. Marx was banking on that. It institutionalizes malicious envy. It's very destructive. Lenin was a nihilist who liked Marx. He was very pragmatic. He's a creep. The February Revolution was a bread riot demanding food, not political change. This was not a revolution that started out for philosophical or ideological reasons. The people were hungry. And the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution, Red October, which was funded and engineered by Germany to get Russia out of the war. And was done in cahoots with the United States. Germans sent Lenin back to Russia. They exiled him, and they footed the bill to get rid of him. They put him on a train and sent him back to Russia. Big mistake. In other words, the German foreign minister, not some low-level flunky or a subversive communist nestled in the German government, but the actual German foreign minister, smuggled what amounted to an exiled terrorist cell and its ringleader back into a rival country. The German government even footed the bill. As Winston Churchill so vividly described it, the Germans turned upon Russia the most grisly of all weapons. They transported Lenin in a sealed truck like a plague bacillus from Switzerland into Russia. This threw Russia into chaos. The Bolsheviks took over and withdrew Russia from the war. Then Lenin began a violent, lawless state in economic freefall. In 1918, the Bolsheviks started the Russian Communist Party, and their motto was "Loot the looters." And it was a violent riot the size of a country. Anybody who had anything had it stolen by somebody. Faberge barely escaped with his life to Switzerland and lost all of his business. The state took everything and the art, and it disappeared into the hands of private collectors. Safety deposit boxes were emptied, jewelry was stolen, churches were robbed. There was malicious envy, and it turned into a frenzy of violence. Even Gorky, who was a critic of the Tsar and a friend of Lenin, was appalled. He couldn't hide his disgust. Even he condemned what he called the malicious desire to ruin objects of rare beauty. They rob and sell churches and museums. They sell cannons and rifles. They pilfer army warehouses. They rob the palaces of former Grand Dukes. Everything that can be plundered is plundered. Everything that can be sold is sold. In new Red Russia, you could have whatever you could take from the White Russians, the loyalists, the aristocracy, and the bourgeoisie. That is, until someone bigger took it from you. Along the way, everything and everyone was an appropriate target for the anger of millions. Gorky insisted that in the course of 2 revolutions and 1 war, I observed hundreds of instances of this dark, vindictive urge to smash, cripple, ridicule, and defame the beautiful. It was the poisonous flowering of benign and malicious envy merged that really gave birth to what we think of as communist Russia. They decimated their own culture, and then they rewrote history. For example, things were not better in communist Russia, and in most cases, they were far worse. Before the revolution, Russia had more wealth than all of Europe combined. There were many wealthy families, and many were aristocratic, but there were many common families who were wealthy also. The bourgeoisie, the bankers, lawyers, craftsmen, were successful and wealthy. The serfs were badly off, as always, and they wanted to replace the Tsar with his brother. They didn't want to overthrow the system. The October Revolution was a coup, not an act of the will of the people. The October Revolution of Lenin did not have popular support. It had to use brute force. It was a vindictive seizure of goods, and a lot of people, a lot of former middle class and ordinary people were put into forced labor camps. And there was a lot of death from manufactured famines, reminiscent of the manufactured famine in Ukraine under Stalin, where millions of people died and resorted to cannibalism. It was a terrible situation, but I'm digressing. Leon Trotsky stated that we communists recognize only one sacred right, the right of the working man, his wife, and child to live. Sounds nice. He went on to say, we did not hesitate to wrest the land away from the landlords, to transfer the factories, mills, and railroads into the hands of the people. Trotsky went further, justifying the actions of those who, by the force of arms, tore the crown from the stupid czar's head. Still standard issue regime change. We hit the real problem with his conclusion. Why then should we hesitate to take the grain away from the kulaks? The kulaks were the peasants. They didn't have jeweled eggs or thriving industries. They were farmers. They were only slightly more successful than their nearest starving neighbors. The top-down terror that started with the royal family had trickled all the way down to the peasants. Even they were subject to economic destructuring within the first year. The result of this loot the looters economic policy was total economic chaos. Within the year, hyperinflation in Russia made it impossible to exchange a diamond bracelet for a loaf of bread. In the first of many bitter ironies, the treasure that had partially inspired the explosion were now so worthless that they could not even be traded for food. Oh, now what have I got here to read? The communists failed because they removed positional good. Nothing had value. Absolutely nothing had value. In 1919, Maxim Gorky stated that only the commissars live a pleasant lifestyle these days. They steal as much as they can from the ordinary people in order to pay for their courtesans and their unsocialist luxuries. It turns out when nothing belongs to anyone and there's no way to compare or compete, the system just crumbles under all that fairness. Bankers at first would not give Lenin money. So what he did was he kidnapped their family members and their friends. So all bankers got together and made an agreement. They handed Lenin the keys to the vaults and they walked out, every single banker. And Lenin did not know how to run a bank. So he ran his government by selling the valuables in the safe deposit boxes, but they ran out of that. They started selling state treasures and state art, and they decided they'd get it back when they ran the world, so that was okay. They ripped apart jewelry, old books, and art for the jewels and the gold, which diminished the value of all of it. They flooded international markets, and as a result, what happened? The value dropped. Stalin stole power after Lenin died, and he killed off all of his rivals. He drove Trotsky into exile. I believe Trotsky was murdered in Mexico, if I remember correctly. It was a power grab. Russia, again, had an autocrat. They needed a subversive source of capital, and in steps Armand Hammer. He was a liar, a thief, a traitor, a war profiteer, a con artist, a carny, a treacherous, backstabbing success. He sold fake Romanov story, Faberge eggs for money. He sold the story to make the money. He was a captain of industry for Occidental Petroleum. He was considered a citizen diplomat, a global association philanthropist, and an art collector. He even lobbied to get the Nobel Prize. He died in 1990, and most significantly of all, he was a Soviet spy. He was born in the United States of Ukraine parents. His father helped found the United States Communist Party. He started a drugstore, the Allied Drug and Chemical, and then he went to prison. Armand got a government permit to go to Europe and spent 10 years in Russia. He traded United States grain for jewels, and he got really close to Lenin, and he became Lenin's foreign middleman. He acted as a conduit for Soviet financial activities in the U.S., illegal activities. The Allied drug company laundered money. He brokered illegal business deals with Henry Ford, to send tractors to Russia and to hide their origin. They made similar deals with other companies, and when nine were taken by the Soviets, he was given Faberge's factory for $12 a month. So what was he doing there? He was really accumulating a warehouse of pre-revolutionary treasure, stocking it up in Faberge's old factory. And he took all of this to the United States in 1929 and started selling it all in the United States. He put emerald and diamond markets into free fall, and because of the glut on the market, because the Russians had so much in the way of crown jewels. All these extended noble families had a ton of jewelry. This was very advantageous to Russia because it was money laundering. So after the fall of Russia, this was all revealed in a dossier, The Secret History of Armand Hammer by Edward Epstein. Interesting little coincidence there, don't you think? All the stuff he sold belonged to the Soviet government. He didn't buy it. He didn't own it. He didn't get it on any market. His brother finally came out, Hammer's brother finally came out and admitted that he got this stuff directly from the Russians and sold it on commission. And the money went to the Russians and through the Allied drug company for laundering. The FBI knew that he was an agent. They monitored him for 20 years. He was referred to as Stalin's U.S. field representative. That's not a good look. He got department stores to show the treasures of Faberge. He hired fake royalty to stand around crying about their stolen family heirlooms. And he whipped up this desire in middle-class America to own Faberge objets. And they sold like hotcakes, and as soon as the real stuff ran out, he counterfeited them. He had Faberge originals. He had the dye for their stamp, and so he got French knockoffs and authenticated them with the real stamp, and they automatically became Faberge. And he was basically selling these fakes, selling symbolism, selling history and tragedy and royalty. There was an emotional attachment to the idea. He was selling a fantasy, and they were valueless, but he was selling them for high value based on these emotional things. Perception. It's all perception. He was an international fence, and the Soviets did not let him pocket the money. So America funded the first years of the USSR. I'm going to stop here. That's the end of part 4. And we will start part 5 with the third section of the book called Have. And I hope you're enjoying it. I think it's absolutely fascinating. All this historical stuff is great stuff. So I'll be back in a minute. Sláinte.